a little slow. Okay, perfect. So we're live. Fantastic. I just want to say thank you so much to our panelists and to all of the folks who are joining us today. My name's Taylor and I'm from Belonging Brant, and myself, alongside a team of local agencies and community organizers, have put together this wonderful week of events. I just, again, thank you for being part of the 2021 Asset-Based Community Development Symposium. This year obviously looks very different from the lovely in-person symposiums that we've been able to host in the past, but being able to connect in this virtual space has offered us some really fantastic opportunities to engage and connect with brilliant, creative, playful, and resilient community connectors and community builders who are from both within and beyond our local community, which is really fantastic. Big thank yous to our community partners and to the Ontario Trillium Foundation. I just want to express that I'm so thrilled and excited to be learning from our panelists today. These folks are incredible community builders, and their work is rooted in liberatory practice and community connection, and I'm just really thrilled that they could be here with us today. As we begin today's conversation about connection and action and mobilizing and ideas of liberation and asset-based community development, it's really crucial that we ground ourselves in the histories and futures of this place and the places where we live. Across this amazing digital network we've cultivated throughout the past week, there have been numerous stories of land, treaties, and stewardship. As hosts, we're located on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral peoples. This land is part of the Haldimand Tract and is understood within the Two-Row Wampum Belt Covenant and Dish with One Spoon Treaty. These treaties instruct all of us to honor the original peoples of this land as stewards of this space, to embrace and celebrate the ecology and networks of nature and animals that grow here, and to live lives of peaceful non-interference. We urge each of you to become familiar with the treaties and nations of the land where you live in order to more wholly inform the work that you do and to more deeply connect with the concepts of community that we're discussing here. With that in mind, we'd love it if folks can share a bit more about where you're from in the comments, and also we'd love to know how you found this event. We also want to acknowledge the lineage of disability justice advocates whose work for the cultivation of more inclusive online spaces has informed so many of the ways that we're able to easily connect during COVID-19. We're grateful to the generations of thinkers and activists who came before us to instruct and inform these resources, accessibility tools, and social distancing techniques that have become the lifeboat to our communities during these distance times. We really encourage engagement in this space, so feel free to use the chat and hit the reaction buttons when folks are sharing information that inspires you. And feel free to participate in the Q&A, whether you're joining us on Zoom or through the YouTube live stream. With that in mind, though, I will encourage you to just stay muted while other folks are talking. So without further ado, let me pass things off to this afternoon's brilliant moderator, Jess Doroshenko. I've had the pleasure of knowing and organizing with Jess for a number of years. When we were kids, Jess actually ran what was called the Activism Club at our high school. I was a super timid 9th grader and remember being so inspired by her orientation to social justice and equity. Jess is a community-minded and care-rooted person who works at the Sexual Assault Center of Brant and is co-chair of The Bridge, which is a group in town that works to identify and address inequities that are experienced by diverse sexual and gender-identified communities within Brant County. Jess has had a hand in organizing the annual Take Back the Night demonstration in Brantford, as well as supporting local youth in various actions and peer-led education work to combat gender-based violence in our community. So with that, I am thrilled to pass things over to Jess.
Thank you so much for that, Taylor. What a lovely intro. We were chatting right before we kind of jumped into this about how I did not send Taylor a bio, so I'm so grateful that she was able to get one together for me, and very, very appreciative of that. And it's really my pleasure to be here today and to get to facilitate some conversation with some wonderful activists. And so I'm gonna start by introducing the folks that we have on our panel today. And I'm going to start with our first person, who is Anne Livingston. Anne is a community organizer who works to improve access to citizenship for people who use illegal drugs. Anne organized with PWUD to form several drug users groups, including the BC Association of People on Opiate Maintenance, the Western Aboriginal Harm Reduction Society, the BC Yukon Association of Drug War Survivors, and the Canadian Association of People Who Use Drugs. Anne has advised the Vancouver Injection Drug User Survey, the Naomi and Salome Heroin Trials, BCCSU, and the City of Vancouver. So thank you and welcome, Anne. Anne, I saw you waving when I first started to introduce you. Maybe you can wave one more time for us so we can draw attention to you. Awesome, thank you. And next up, I want to introduce Cheyenne. So Cheyenne Sundance likes growing food because of the independence it brings her and her community. She's a self-taught farmer out of necessity due to the lack of anti-oppressive and food justice funds in Ontario. Cheyenne is a food and community justice advocate. She has extensive skills in workshop facilitation and project startups. Cheyenne started Sundance Harvest from nothing but stubbornness, a nurturing love of the land, and a drive to see true equity in agriculture. And Cheyenne also sits on the board of Food Secure Canada. So Cheyenne, do you want to give us a wave? And it looks like you're coming to us from a greenhouse today, which feels very, very fitting. That's awesome. And next up, last but not least, our third panelist is Krystal Riverz. And Krystal is a local community organizer who works across systems to provide action, advocacy, and to resource the people in the community. So Krystal is the director of River Rockz Hip Hop Grassroots Project. Krystal, do you want to give us a wave? Awesome. Thank you. And I was saying to Krystal before, I love that cool background that you've got. I'm still trying to figure that out for myself, the background. So it's really my honor to be here today to moderate some discussion about connecting through action with this wonderful panel. And the very first place that my mind went when I was kind of thinking about what questions do I want to pose to this group, I always love knowing kind of people's roots and sort of what initially drew them to the work that they're doing. So I would love if each of you would share with us what initially drew you to the work that you're doing, and maybe tell us a little bit about what's keeping you there. And I wonder if we want to maybe go in the same, I'm going to keep shaking it up, but maybe we want to go in the same order that we started out, and then I'll reverse the order for the next question. But I'd love to start with Anne. What initially drew you to the work that you're doing, and what's keeping you there today?
So I think I grew up in a family where my mother was kind of a community organizer, and it wasn't kind of weird then, and it wasn't a paid position. People seemed to get around people's dining room tables and do things about things that were a problem, or, not whatever, or not a problem. But so I moved to the downtown east side and live in a Four Sisters housing co-op. And when I moved there, I had a child who was I think 12, and then 6 and 4. And there was right in the height of an overdose emergency, and there's a fire hall right next door. So it was just sirens day and night and sirens day and night. And I had this real sense that something needed to be done, and the NDP government was in. And I thought, well, I'll call the Minister of Health and I'll let them know that the welfare system's screwed up and it's causing people these health problems. And then, the housing thing, you know what I mean? It was like this, I still have the same idea that they could do that. And 30 years later, they've still never done any of that. And what my
is on your plate, we'll put on our plate,
was that if it's people who use drugs that are dying, it's people who use drugs are excluded. They couldn't get so much as a meal, or sleep in a shelter, or wash their clothes, or take a shower. They were barred from everywhere. And it was a very popular kind of thing. If we're cruel to drug users, then they'll see the light and they'll stop using. And anyway, so my impulse over many years was, what you do if there's a problem is you organize those people. And my oldest child has cerebral palsy, and he's recently passed away. But I knew of John McKnight's work, and his work is very clear. It was such an awakening to understand that it wasn't services we needed for our children; they needed friends. So that's how I began, and we had it was kind of a fluke, but it was also a real affinity that I had for not having any kind of revulsion for people who are in really terrible physical condition, and my curiosity about who they were always overrode almost any other obstacle. So I still like that. I was going, who is that guy? What's his story? So anyway, it's it keeps me going now, partly because there is, you know, I don't think it's a great motivator in a sense, but it just doesn't seem like it's an option not to do something. We've got, you know, worsening overdose deaths. And despite almost all the work I've done as an activist, which some of it's been viewed as very successful, all we've managed to do is get services that they treat these people like clients, except our drug user groups. And so you know, we were fortunate enough to get a grant, and now we're seeding drug user groups in many communities, often very small communities, but other big cities. So we've got like 10 started from last year, and COVID has just been a huge problem because all our work is person-to-person meetings and people don't have technology for Zoom. We make sure our board does, you know, so we're doing whatever we can, but you can really feel the impediment that it's sort of criminalized that you go into a room and talk to each other. And I mean it, they come with a gun and they're this mask enforcement unit. I didn't even know this until it happened to us. So I kind of play along with it and I say, everyone wear the uniform, but it's extremely emotionally difficult to understand that they're concerned about someone catching COVID at a drug user meeting when they're really at risk to die from overdose. They don't have so much as access to a toilet or shower, and they're ejected from emergency rooms. So I have a real thing about keeping my lid on when I talk to these people, you know, that this is what we're concerned about, whether they get COVID. Because frankly, if you get COVID in Surrey right now, you can get 2 weeks in a hotel. So it's to people, I started thinking, oh my God, there's going to be a thing. Can someone help me test positive for COVID so I get 2 weeks in a motel? Just saying. And they'll bring you all your drugs and alcohol and everything. You're set. You're in. So it was like, I better not tell the public this because they'll just hate drug users more because they already hate them so much. But anyway, that's why I guess that's why I've kept going, and that's how I got started.
Thanks so much for that, Anne. Yeah, thank you. And the systems, the current state of things is just, it's not set up to serve the folks who maybe need it the most. And yeah, I look forward to kind of exploring that. Just the nature of systems more as we delve deeper into our conversation. And Cheyenne, I'd love to hear from you. What initially drew you to the work that you're doing, and what's keeping you there today?
Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, I'm coming from work, so I'm in one of the seedling greenhouses. But what drew me to do the work I do with Sundance Harvest? So when I was 18, I went to Cuba for a bit to hang out with some friends, and then I stumbled upon a farm that my friend's family was operating, and I ended up just hanging out there and seeing how their relationship with the land was very different than what I saw in Canada and in the States. And then I came back to Toronto, and I really wanted to do something revolving in agriculture. And I didn't want to leave my community here and my support base, so that's why I didn't move rurally. I couldn't find one farm, even an hour away from Toronto, or even an urban farm in the city that was run in an equitable way. So that paid their employees a fair wage, that didn't use, unpaid labor from interns, but that also had an anti-oppressive framework. So that had, Black women in leadership, that had BIPOC people in positions of power at the farm. It had a good structure where, employees could get all their knowledge they need and therefore start their own projects. So I really couldn't find anywhere to actually learn to grow food in a structured way. I can learn about business. So then I started Sundance Harvest kind of as a blueprint so that people like me who would like to start a farm can see the Sundance Harvest and see that it worked in a city like Toronto where the rent is extremely high. So it worked. And then I noticed that just having a farm wasn't enough and that I needed to do a structured program. So that's why I started Growing the Margins. And Growing the Margins is a free 12-week program for youth who are Black, Indigenous, persons of color. And these youth, for 12 weeks, we have 20 youth 3 times a year. So 3 cohorts a year. They learn everything from seed starting to composting to business planning and marketing, really anything they need. And all the youth come to Growing the Margins either because they want to start a farm for themselves or they want to work on food sovereignty in their community. So they want to go back to their communities and they want to work with the local communities to strengthen food sovereignty. It's not really gardening, so it's very structured, and that's why there's a very regimented program. I'm not the only teacher, which makes it a lot better because we have lovely teachers from my friend Adam at Food Share, who is revolutionary and talks about farming. And I also have other teachers as well who are also BIPOC. So there's a range of identities from queer farmers to trans farmers to Black farmers to Indigenous farmers. So the youth get to have a full embodied experience and learn how to grow food in a dynamic and also representative way. So that's kind of how I got started, and that's kind of how Sundance is evolving. But Growing the Margins just separated as a non-for-profit. So it's a bit of a different road now, but I'm still the director of it.
That is so cool. Thank you, Cheyenne. I love youth programming. I personally, that's like something dear to my heart is programming that serves youth and works with youth and sort of gives people tangible skills that they can, take and implement. And also like the fact that you're working towards more food sustainability and just that equity is built in at every step that sounds like such a neat program. Thank you for sharing. And I want to now ask Krystal the same question. So Krystal, what initially drew you to the work that you're currently doing, and what is it that's keeping you there today?
Hey, I was just writing that down. Cheyenne, I really like your youth project. It sounds pretty awesome, and I'd like to chat with you more about it afterwards, perhaps. Yeah, so what got me into what I'm doing now? I guess I've been passionate about youth work since I was a youth. So I grew up on like the streets of Brantford, Six Nations, and then also in group homes in Kitchener area. So I grew up in like foster homes, group homes, juvenile facilities, all that kind of stuff. And so I think I got a lot of social work experience just based on my upbringing. And when I was living in Safe Haven, a group home in Kitchener, I was there longer than the project manager, and she could, or the whole director of the group home, and she could see the way that I was with the other youth that were in there. Whenever they were like going through stuff, they would want to talk to me instead of the staff. Like I'd get knocks on my door sometimes in the middle of the night, and they'd be like, "So and so is having a breakdown. They only want to speak to you." And so I was just kind of like there for a lot of the other youth that were in there. And then so she took notice of me and she asked me to help her develop this diversion program. So instead of sending youth to jail, she would send them to this diversion, or through the courts, they would send them to this diversion program. And it was based on the premise of like going to jail just kind of teaches you the same patterns of criminal, lifestyle choices and whatnot, makes you get more connections in that area. But this diversion program would instead teach you alternatives to that lifestyle. And so they got like a whole bunch of grant money for it. I got a nice little reference letter and I was back in juvie within like a week. So, but that I still have that reference letter and that little binder. And so I started to realize that like they called me a youth advocate. And so I guess I've kind of worn that hat ever since. And so I've done that in many different ways. I've always just tried to be there for my people, like, for my friends, and then for children, and for anybody, I guess, that, comes across my path, and, just being true like that, I guess. But then I started a magazine in 2012 called Word on the Street. And we did like, instead of highlighting all the negative things the youth were doing, we wanted to highlight the positive things that they were doing. And so, and we wanted to make it cool and stuff. So we covered like skateboarding and breakdancing and, like parkour and all these cool things. And I realized like I wanted to have a what's happening page to connect them to things that were happening in the community. And I realized there wasn't really anything happening in the community. And so I started to make things happen. And so we would have street sports parties for the editions, for each edition. And then we would cover that in the magazine. And then I went off to university and realized communications wasn't for me. And then I ended up coming back home to my res, Six Nations, and launched my own youth project. And so I guess one of the vital points that I should have made in that is that growing up on the streets and in the environments that I did, I had a lot of friends that passed away really early on. Like I could say at least half of my friends from back in the day are like passed on, or they're in jail, or they've become drug dealers. What I'd say closer to 75%. And so, like, that's like kind of my biggest concern and my motivator that keeps me going is that like looking at the youth today and realizing, they have potential, right? And they have like, I know there's a range of paths, but if we're to speak generally, like they've got like two paths in front of them, like a fork in the road, right? And they can, you know, make choices today that are going to lead them down to the path of destruction that I witnessed time and time and time again, you know, heartbreakingly. Or they can, you know, turn to something that motivates them and feels them good. But they need support. They need to feel supported. They need to be heard. They need to feel valued and respected. There's like vital things that they need to feel about themselves. You know, I think that what leads people towards drugs and violence and that kind of lifestyle and self-harm is just not caring for yourself or not thinking that you're worth anything. And so we really just want to big them up, and we don't want to like force them to do whatever they don't want to do. We just like, what do you like to do? Okay, let's support you in doing that. And so River Rockz, it's like we have a variety of artistic practices that we practice with them. So the elements of hip hop, right? And so there's visual art or graffiti, there's DJing or drumming or beat making, there's dancing. So that can, and like I'm native from Six Nations Mohawk, so there's smoke dance, there's fancy dance, like the different kinds of powwow dances. And then there's also like hip hop dance, so like break dance, breaking, b-girling, b-boying, and you know. And then there's also the other element of emceeing, which can also be seen as like lyricism, poetry, and rapping, right? So they're kind of, there's like a whole teaching in there. But yeah, so we want to like work with them. And then also like in terms of fashion, I've been doing a lot of like sewing lately. So, you know, to be a powwow dancer, you also need a regalia to go along with that powwow dance. And so we've been making regalias with the youth. We just want to make them feel supported and loved and cared for and heard and seen and like empowered, you know? And so I guess just so, you know, they feel good about themselves. Basically, I think at the end of the day, that's really what it's about. We just want to make them feel good about themselves so that, you know, they feel good about making good choices.
Thank you so much, Krystal. And I really appreciate just your you seeing the need. And I think that all of our panelists today have kind of seen like a need in their community and have responded to that, right? And have sort of been able to see the potential in their fellow community members that maybe is, you know, going just unnoticed, and being able to actually tap into that potential and help folks to see that in themselves too. And I think that that's really what community work is all about. So yeah, I'm really grateful to hear all of your kind of what drew you to your callings and what's keeping you there. And for me, I think sometimes in our activism, it can be hard to sometimes it's hard to think about groups that you aren't you know, if you're a member of a group, it's very easy to kind of understand the needs of that particular group. But if you maybe are not a member of that group, where you you know, are kind of trying to meld and bring different communities together, it can sometimes be very challenging. And so I'm curious to hear from our panelists how they build inclusivity, like true inclusivity. How do we build that into our activism? What do we need to be thinking about in order to ensure that the work that we're doing is as inclusive as it possibly can be? And I think I'll shake up the order just a little bit, and I might start with Cheyenne for this question, if you're okay with that. So how can we build true inclusivity into our activism?
Hi, yeah, I moved outside because it was way too hot in the greenhouse.
Fair.
So building inclusivity in activism, I would say from my experience with like growing in the margins, the easiest thing is trying to meet youth where they're at. So I understand that like not everyone has the capacity to write a 2-page cover letter to get into growing the margins, which is a part of the requirement. So I make sure I accept audio files so people can verbally speak into a microphone and they can send me that file. People can call me and we can just have like a one-to-one conversation if they feel like technology isn't their strong suit, or for example, they don't have a phone. They can come to the site if they're a local youth in the neighborhood, and they can talk to me whenever they feel fit. So those are the small things I can think of. And then on the macro level is figuring out what programming will really set them up for success. And to have a business planning workshop about spreadsheets isn't something that a lot of youth, even myself at 23, can handle very well, because I don't really like math personally. So instead, I think about ways to really narrow it down and make sure what I'm teaching is easily accessible. So I basically talk about having 3 different income streams. So maybe you grow tomatoes, but also you grow lettuce, and maybe you make, beeswax bombs in the summertime for people with dry hands. You can sell that in the winter. So very simplified process of things. So I think those are the 2 things I can think about I do with my activism to try to make sure that it's inclusive. And also I understand that I am not a representation of everyone, right? Sure, like I'm a Black woman, but I'm not, a trans woman, or I'm not a queer woman. So I really ensure that with Growing the Margins, I have teachers that represent that. So making sure I bring in people that don't represent me, and bringing in people that can represent the culture of many of these youth that I don't reflect. So just trying to do small things like that, I guess.
Thank you so much for that, Cheyenne. Yeah, I think that that really resonates with me, to meeting people where they're at, especially in youth work. I think that programs just being flexible and actually able to kind of consult with people is so important in the work that we do with young people specifically. I'm gonna ask Anne the same question. And what in your mind, Anne, is involved in building true inclusivity into your activism?
Well, for many years, our problem was that we didn't have any funding, and we got funded. So for many years, I lived on welfare. So I know about being poor. And the very kind of heart of the documents that we've drawn up for funding. So we became a fund granting agency, much to our horror. We got $1 million. Then we tell you want to start a user group in your town, then get a hold of us. And we made sure that if they couldn't fill out the form, we could do it over the phone with them. But one of the things that's a real tendency with this work, especially once it's funded, it's really, really hard to do when there's no funding, but you just want enough funding, because as soon as you get too much funding, and I just want to make this comment, I don't know if it happens with other vulnerable groups, but I really observe that if there's a population you're working with who, if they were sexually assaulted by someone or anything, that's a serious allegation, they wouldn't be believed if they told, and so we've got, actually, it's a bit of a magnet for predators, or a magnet for people who want to work with an unaccountable, you know what I mean? Just saying. So I'm always trying to emphasize with the government and with everybody that we need to always go out of our way to be super protective of this group. It's 40% of the people we're working with are Indigenous in the city. And now that I'm in Surrey, I'm not seeing an Indigenous population, but we're in a neighborhood of South Asian guys. And we're just trying to figure out how we can get someone in there who can translate for us. And anyway, one of the things that we had to do, which was sort of against our nature, was to say, if you do not follow our guidelines and become a real drug user group, and that means you must find a location, you can't just kind of park yourself in a big NGO, and and it's tough. That's the toughest actual task. But once you get it, now there's a place, and everybody goes, oh my God, I joined this group and we have a place. And now the contradiction is that basically we ask people who have a kind of type A personality to have the oomph to kind of ask for the money, fill out the application form. I usually get them the place because they all have to speak in code. But anyway, once they start, then we're very strict. You've got to start a democracy within your group, and they have this paralyzing fear of a democracy, which is nuts. Because I keep saying this is leadership development, and it's that paradox of leadership where you give away your power in order to gain your power. And this is too subtle, and like I said, we haven't been able to do as much in person kind of instructing as we'd like. So that's how we include the most marginalized. The other thing is that we're looking at measuring, there's a kind of definition of what we call a drug user group, or an association of people who use drugs, whatever wording you want to use, where you must include the most marginalized users, because it's just not got the same function if you don't. So anyway, we do that kind of measurement by saying, how many meetings are you holding? And then we haven't got to this point, so because we're just in our second year of this kind of real programming, or whatever you call it, where you're funded. You just take a scan of the meeting and you say, this many people appear to be women, this many people appear to be Indigenous, and then, you know, kind of have this sense so that if we're challenged by funders at some point and they go, well, it's all just white men in your groups, we would be able to say, no, in fact, we have a sense of who is in our group. And it's also good for the internal group to say, who's not here? You know, who do we know? Like with us, we get to look at all these horrible data of deaths, and then we can sometimes get more information and know the overdose rates are disproportionately affecting men. We know the age groups. We know a little bit about it, how many Indigenous people, it's very disproportionately affecting them. So then the board, and this is like a capacity building thing with your board, you may be a bunch of street users, you know, and treated like that and have your own internalized oppression of yourself as a person who not only doesn't matter, but is a bad person. You know what I mean? There's a lot of tremendous stigmatization that goes on, and that people internalize it. I'm just saying, but that they start to view themselves as responsible board members who are overseeing a budget of $1 million a year, who, like, you know what I mean? This is like grown-up stuff. And I think this is like what I'm constantly arguing with there's this new kind of token designation of peers. We go, well, we hire peers or we consult with peers. And I'm like, oh God, they got fake user groups everywhere. Because then they do handpick who they want to be representative. And we're just saying, if you don't have marginalized people, your success can't be measured except your involvement of marginalized people. So we've tried to kind of write it into things. So I don't know if I'm being clear enough, but it's certainly will deal with diversity, I can tell you that, because it's just, if you help involve, empower, you know, have people, you know what I mean, in your group that are very marginalized, then it will help all the other people who use drugs who are not marginalized. Believe me, they'll gain. So I'm just getting all these calls and texts because Kaya died last night. But anyway, just saying, we swim in deaths, and
well, that's really makes it real. And when we're getting the text messages during the panel, and I really appreciated what you were saying about being able to kind of look at sort of who's not sitting at the table and who's not sort of part of that decision-making process, and not informing what's happening. Because I think that so often it's, you know, doing community work, doing community building work and activism can feel like a bit of an uphill push. And so sometimes we don't actually pause and sort of say, wait a second, like who aren't we thinking about? And yeah, I think that's really important.
I think I try and introduce it as an art and a science. So you need to look at the data. We need to be experts on our own health data, and every drug user in Surrey should know, what's the overdose rate in Surrey? Was it a record high this year? Is it more men than women? What is the age group? If I can do that part, I find the art part, this is where these people have this tremendous asset, because they are those people, and they're looking and going, you know, and they'll get these brilliant ideas. And, you know, just in terms of why, you know what I mean? Like, you know what I mean? I don't know how to describe it, but nobody knows what they know except them, because they live in such a profoundly underground economy and an underground life.
Well, it sounds like what you're describing is sort of that kind of the truest form of allyship, right? And sort of really taking guidance from the people who are centered in the change making you're trying to affect. And so they're listening to like the needs, and I think Cheyenne was mentioning this before too, but really like listening to the needs of what the community is that you're supporting, and actually centering that and centering those voices, and creating that space, and then kind of, you know, backing away from it, I think is such an important thing. And it sounds like that's kind of how you're set up. So I want to shift, and I want to give Krystal the opportunity to respond to the same question. So we were just thinking about how can we build true inclusivity into the work that we're doing.
So what comes to mind? So like For my program currently, it's very specific, right? So we work with Indigenous youth, and we also want to work with Black youth as well, but being on reserve. We're mostly working with Indigenous youth, and so we're very adamant about having like Indigenous mentors. And so we want to bring on, and when we have more Black youth involved, we want to bring on Black mentors as well. So we want to make sure, like, I don't know if it's inclusivity in my mind, but I don't know if that's going to be seen by others. But it's just, I feel like it's really important to, like, when you're working with people, to have people connecting that relate with one another, you know? And so I guess that's like kind of a thing with regards to our project. But we also work with, like, before COVID was a thing, we were invited to some classrooms. And so we were working with youth of all different backgrounds, and we're sharing like teachings regarding the treaties with them, and then we built a spoken word poetry play together. They all submitted poems and stuff, and so I guess it kind of had that truth and reconciliation vibe, but it was more about combating climate change. And so, like, I think just at the end of the day, realizing that we're all human and that we all come from the earth, and then we all need to protect the earth, and so we need to come together. And so I think finding common ground is very important, relating with one another, but also making sure that you're all on the same page and working towards the same goals, so I feel like that's a thing. And then also in terms of working with my youth, I also struggle sometimes with calling myself a teacher, although I aspire to be a teacher because I'd like to work with youth and exchange knowledge. But that's how I like to see things, is that reciprocal. I'm not like this all-knowing mentor teacher that's coming to give you all of the answers and you're going to be saved by it. That's like so not the way to perceive it in my mind. So the way I like to say it, when I'm working with youth, I'm like, hey, so I got some knowledge and skills and you got some knowledge and skills, like, let's make an exchange. I always call it collaboration, right? And so, like, whenever we create something, it's a collaboration between me and the youth, right? And it's not like I'm the director of all things that made this happen and you're welcome. So that's like I guess that's kind of how I would perceive inclusivity in the work that I do.
I love that, Krystal, and I love I just love the reciprocal nature that you're describing. And I think that is like true inclusivity, right? Is when we're not sort of creating a hierarchy of like whose knowledge is more valuable than someone else's knowledge, and like that unilateral kind of, I'm giving you the information you need because I hold the power. It's an exchange, and we want to share out that power and just recognize that everyone has access to that personal power. And I think that's so cool, and I love that approach. Especially I think in youth work. I work with everyone, I think, but in youth work, I think it's really important to be having those power sharing dynamics, and not just holding all of that. I also love what you're talking about in sort of seeing yourself represented, and like having that being a really important part of sort of creating these inclusive spaces, is when we can have people who see themselves represented in leadership roles, right? And so I think that's super duper important, and I'm glad that you do that and that you touched on that too. Thank you.
I just wanted to add also to that, though, co-ownership of things. Like, so there's like the whole teacher and student dynamic, but then there's also, I guess, ownership of the project and the program itself, right? Because I wouldn't have a youth project if I didn't have youth. And so, I guess I'm kind of slightly in the youth category, but I still consider myself an adult. But in terms, like, that's another thing we're shifting into, developing an internship program. So we want to give them the skills that they need to run the program. But that's the biggest thing, is that making sure that their input on how the whole thing gets run is taken into consideration, for sure. Like that we're taking it and we're asking them, so what are the things that you want to do? How do you think we should work with this? Like, what do you think will work? What do you think won't work? And making sure that they have that ownership of the project. And that's like kind of what I'm doing with it right now, like where I'm just building the foundation and I'm getting ready to pass it off to them. Because the idea is that it's going to become their project that they're running and that they're lifting other youth up, you know? And so I think that's another important element of reciprocation, and not holding so tightly to ideas of ownership, but really, really like humbling yourself and, you know, making sure that it's a reciprocal effort, it's an exchange, and that you're all in it together. It's a group effort. You become a crew and you're creating stuff together, right? So that's kind of.
I love that sense of shared ownership too. That is, yeah, that's important. Like that collaborative nature and sort of that accountability to one another. I think that's how we start to build really strong communities, is when we do feel that sense of accountability to one another. And it sounds like that's also kind of what you're describing, Krystal, what you're kind of like building into the work that you're doing. And I think that that's so cool. The next thing that I wanted to know a bit more about is how you have seen your work creating connections for people. How have you either seen your work helping other community organizations connect to you, or other community members maybe who previously weren't very well connected get connected? So maybe the more simple question that I'm asking is sort of, how has the work that each of you has been doing fostered connections within your communities? And I think that I'm going to shake up the order again. I want to keep it so that we're not going just the same order every time. But I think I will jump back to Anne, if you wanted to give us your sense of sort of, how has the work that you're doing fostered some of those connections within the community, or connections of the specific community you're serving? How are they getting connected to other communities?
So our group is not an NGO, and it's membership run, and people join and then they get a vote, and then you have these AGMs and who's going to be on the board. So we have this within our group. But what I observe, as you know, I have the privilege of kind of going to these startups, and oddly, the first thing that happens is something I never tell our funder, although I suppose I should now. They all start networking about, if they're still active drug users, they network about where they can get drugs. And it is life or death for sure. So it's important, I guess. I tend not to talk about it that much, because I think people then go, well, they're all dealing drugs at your place. And there's a kind of a precious impression, like, as this whole movement, it's become sort of politically correct to have peers and drug users, people with living and lived experience, and they put them on all these committees. And then, to the horror of these often people who work in the government or in these giant NGOs, you know, $60 million is very common, with a big budget. They go, oh, they actually use drugs, and they're so surprised. And then they're magically, they do get drugs, which means drug dealing is going to go around this, because it's, you know what I mean? It's a thing. So that's one of the things we see. But I have to say, they do become friends, and you see the isolation is the real killer for people who use drugs. So the constantly expanding the social networks that people have is great. And then at the most kind of bizarre moments, which, you know, they don't necessarily go anywhere, but you'll see, you know, an architect in Gastown who worked on a committee with a drug user. You see them stop and chat on the street. And I come across them like that. It just cracks me up, because there's no way they would ever have met. So there's the networking within the group. Then there's the networking to often political work, just to say it, or you sit on this committee and that task force and this advisory. So we stay very, very busy with that kind of thing. And then you get these cross-pollinated connections. I think, you know, I've never interviewed those guys. Someone evidently is going to talk to them in this evaluation that's being done, because I think it expands people who've never met a drug user's knowledge and network as well. I don't think they're necessarily getting invited over for dinner, but you can always hope. But anyway, so I guess that's the main way. And just so people know, and we have a tough time with this. I don't know how other people are getting funded here, but, you know, we're sort of seen as, you know, we engage in civil disobedience. It's not really civil disobedience. Just don't ask permission. Just do what needs to be done. And then, you know, it kind of is. But anyway, so it's valued. So you're always trying to find studies and things you can point to, so you can say this is real science, because we're being funded by, if it's the government, you're either involved in some kind of health funding or public health funding, or now we're getting funding through the Overdose Emergency Response Center, because they've had such high rates of overdose. And we had to go and fight with them. We had to go and say, you will fund user groups. You're funding everybody else. And, we were pretty grateful to get the money, but you know what I mean? I'm just saying it comes with a lot of difficulty, because once our 3 years is up, then we may be stuck with this. So I'm always trying to say, hasn't someone studied this? Because it's the third determinant of health. The first one's money, the second one's housing, and the third one's social networks. So I keep saying, this is health. And the more networked people are, the more likely they are not to die, and the more likely they are to thrive in a kind of way. And it oddly doesn't have anything to do with stopping using drugs or even reducing drug use. Although, so that study hasn't been done either to say whether, but the health outcomes, despite poor health choices, the health outcomes, I think there's studies like this, and a big one in the States that was done. People who smoke and drink too much and stuff were studied, and they're overweight and have a bad diet. In a community that has more social connection and social networks, and like informal ones, more than, you're a client and you've got a service provider, they live longer, despite not having changed things that we think will save them, like stopping smoking and not drinking, that kind of thing.
Thanks so much for that, Anne. And I really think I could not agree more with you and with those research findings that, human connection is just invaluable. And it's like we haven't quite figured out how to, I think like we live in a world where we really want to quantify everything, and like we want to know, like, why is that? What's the science behind that? And there's something there, and seeing people building connections and just seeing how that impacts their whole being can be really quite magical. And I think that's, for me personally, I think that's what draws me to community building work, is just sort of seeing people who are building those connections really organically with one another, and seeing how that can create shifts for folks. And I think that's kind of what you're describing. I'm gonna pose the same question to Krystal. And Krystal, we're curious, sort of, how has the work that you're doing been creating connections either amongst different communities, or creating connections kind of within the community that you're working with?
So that's kind of like our main prerogative, I guess, or our priority outcome that we clicked off on the grant box, was making cultural and community connections for the youth, right? So and obviously that was a hard task this year, So like our game plan was we were going to have jams like every other month, and once every 3 months, in the least. We were going to be going to the high schools and working with the students, doing workshops in the high schools or the elementary schools. We were going to be doing setting up weekly workshops in the community. And we were going to be putting on shows, creating music video, doing live performances, and our organizational mentored children's peace theater based in Toronto, we wanted to bring the youth there and be making connections. And so we were set up pretty good to make some pretty awesome connections. But, COVID hit us pretty hard on that one. And so we've been trying, and now it's an ironic, contrast, because now we're in this like grave time of disconnection, and so we're trying to stay connected, and we're trying to expand on our connections, and so we've been, just getting on Zoom with the youth, and we've been doing rhyme sessions, and we created a music video. And so we're going to be premiering that tomorrow, actually. It's actually like a musical. I don't know. It's kind of interesting, but not to get off topic. So that's been a definite challenge this year. The prior year, the year before last year, we we did those things. Like, so we worked with an elementary school, two classes of grade 7 and 8 students, and we created a spoken word poetry performance on climate change. And it was really awesome and cool. And like all the schools in Brantford and Six Nations were in attendance, and so that was really cool. And it was really powerful. I think it really was like a hard-hitting performance for everybody that was in attendance. And then we also worked with a community organization, the Creative Native Project. So Buffy St. Marie actually founded this project, so that was a pretty big deal. And so we worked with them in the youth in creating a live production. So all of the big names of Six Nations were performing, and Buffy St. Marie herself, and DJ Shub, Logan Stotts, all of them, Gus and Neo. They all shared some performances, and then the youth got to showcase their stuff. So I guess that was my role, was making sure that they were being seen and heard, right? And so that their talents were being showcased. And so because I guess the project, it was a pilot project, and so I think the general idea was that they would learn all of the facets of stage production, and so a lot of behind the scenes work with the option to perform if they wanted to. But our youth aren't really like, yeah, I'm gonna get up there and do my thing, they're like really just like kind of reserved, and they want to just like stick to themselves. And you kind of like, and they're not going to be like, they're not yet at that level where they're going to stick up for themselves or speak up. And I found that to be like really a challenge, was making them connect and engage with the project itself. And so that was like a few months process, really, and just getting them to talk, right, and share their input and letting them know that their input is valuable. Like, yo, what you got to say is valuable. Put it in the treasure box, like, come on, And so, so I hosted my own things to go in partnership with it. So we would do all of the creative native workshops, but then I would invite them over to my house for paint parties. And so I give them all canvases and paints and stuff. And like, we gave them the theme. The theme was the space between. Whatever that means for you, this is the theme. Like, living in two worlds, what does that mean for you, right? And so that was the theme that they had to explore, and they all created their own canvases and stuff. And then and then we also shared in this big banner. We created this big banner that says unity. And then we also created another banner that says the space between. And so we collaborated on those things. And then they also had their own pieces. And then so when everybody would show up into the gathering place on the big day of the production, all of their art was showcased all around. So they had like all their easels and their canvases all up for display and labeled and stuff. And so they got to showcase their work that way. And then also I wanted to make sure that they were getting on stage too, right? And so because like we didn't have a certain act for them, it was all these other like musicians and artists and stuff. And so I made sure that, hey, everybody bring your regalia, like DJ Shub is spinning, we'll dance for him, right? And so, and then before we even got up for DJ Shub, Buffy St. Marie had her set, and she's like, hey, I want you guys to come out and dance for Star Rocker. And so that was an amazing moment to dance for Buffy St. Marie on stage, with all of the youth, and it was great. And then DJ Shub had his set, and like we were dancing for his whole half an hour set. They didn't stop. We just kept giving her. It was great. I was exhausted after, but it was awesome, because his music is so upbeat, like just going. Like most performers that dance for like Tribe Called Red and stuff, they'll come on for like 1-2 minutes, then go backstage, catch their breath.
Tiring, yeah.
Going. It was great, yeah. And so, and that everybody felt really good about that. So yeah, I guess so making those connections, it's one of the things we wanted to do, is connect with all those community organizations and collaborate with them, and collaborate with different youth groups and just create something and just feel good in doing it. And so I think that's where, and like with this online COVID thing, yeah, we're just trying to connect online, and we're also trying to expand our reach to other reserves and other urban centers that have like a high like Indigenous and Black population, and try to like build bridges and connections that way. But that's been a challenge. I think that's the challenge that we're up against currently, but
100%.
yeah, we're getting
it's a challenging climate right now. And I feel like I've been looking to a lot of, like, Taylor, who introduced the panel today, I've been looking to do a lot of the work that she's been doing with Belonging Brant, and just a lot of the work that different kind of community organizers are doing to take their programming and get it online, right? And it hasn't been an easy process, but it sounds like you still are finding ways to connect with folks. And I love the part of your story where you're kind of saying that, or what you shared, Krystal, that you were saying that, like, there are a lot of youth who are kind of so quiet, but the fact that they keep showing up, like, in all of my experience with youth work, it's like, you know, if someone's there, it's like, it's because they want to be there. For the most part with youth, like, they'll just not show up if they don't want to show up. And so I think that is, yeah, it's so cool to be able to stick with that and kind of understand that as, like, okay, you're here, you're, like, into this in some way, even if you're not super vocal about it. And they are finding that, you know, community, if they keep coming back, there's some benefit.
Yeah.
Cool. That sounds like such a neat opportunity too, and a neat program to, you know, connect with other folks and just be, like, again, showcased for your art. Like, so cool. That's awesome. I want to ask the same question to Cheyenne. So Cheyenne, how are you seeing your work create connections for folks, or connect folks to other communities that are doing similar work? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I could see that, like, having Sundance Harvest in the city, and Sundance Harvest, I don't think I told it before, but it's a 1/3 of an acre farm with 2 greenhouses. And there's a rooftop flower farm as well in the East End, which is good for folks who are in the East End who can't make it out to this West End location I'm in. But there is limitations for the work I do. For example, Sundance Harvest is the for-profit farm, and Growing in the Margins is a non-profit arm. But while I was building up Growing in the Margins, I didn't have access to, you know, big grants, big funding, because I wasn't actually, like, a non-for-profit legally as Growing in the Margins. So the connections I found and I've made were things like, when I wanted to teach something about, you know, composting, I knew that at my site, I didn't have a large enough space for composting, and I couldn't afford to purchase, like, $10,000 composter. So I actually ended up making a connection with my friend who works at Food Share, who has a composting site. So that way I could still teach and have this valuable resource available to the youth that otherwise I wouldn't have connections with. And then it's actually a very positive thing, because a few of the youth are actually applying to Food Share right now because they built those connections over the course of learning about compost and getting to know the staff there. Another example is farming in the city is great for me because, you know, I have a disability and I'm close to the things I need and people I need supports. But for a lot of the youth who take my programs, they actually would love to move to the countryside or farm in a co-op or a land trust. So I respect that. And what I do is I actually, like, match them with my friends who farm rurally, and they get started with having access to land in that way. So that's more of, like, an interpersonal connection way I do it. And then I guess on the institutional level, and, like, the very institutional level, I just see what things Sundance Harvest is lacking. So I have a capacity, for example, to grow lots of seedlings. So I do have 2,000 square feet greenhouses that are heated. And I know that Sundance Harvest has that option to grow things like tobacco and cedar and sweetgrass. And a lot of the people who use my programs are often from communities that are Indigenous here in Toronto. Maybe they're from communities that aren't in Toronto, but they're Indigenous elsewhere. And what I try to do is, because I'm not Indigenous to the land I'm on right here in Treaty 13, that I grow tobacco every year, and I grow about 1,000 tobacco plants, sometimes 2,000. And I give that as like a solidarity offering, or just like a friendship offering to my friends who are Indigenous, organizations I know here in Toronto, even organizations farther, so 2 hours away, 1 hour away, because I know it's really hard to grow traditional medicines if you don't have the space to do so. So if I have the space, that's one of the ways that I've been trying to build connection over the past while, is to say, okay, I have a resource, so I should share it. And I found that's actually been really beneficial. I get to know people more, and I get to be more grounded in the work I'm doing. And when Growing the Margins actually started, I started with a very small plot behind this behind this church, and the priests were queer and they're super radical, and I was very, like, surprised but also intrigued. And after a while of tending to the land, I obviously moved to the site I'm at right now in Downsview Park, with big space, have lots of area to move around. But then I was talking to some folks from Aboriginal Legal Services here in Toronto, and they were talking about how they didn't have any space to do counseling, because they do a lot of one-on-one counseling and work, especially with COVID, because they can't do it inside. They were just going outside. And then I was like, these people shouldn't have to try to find a way to make counseling work between Indigenous families and elders and relationships. Like, this should be a thing that was just given to them. Like, this is a rightful way it should be. So I said, do you want the garden behind this church, this really radical church? And the church community actually were really opening, and they acknowledged that reconciliation needed to happen. So that's actually one of the ways that I made a connection most recently that I feel pretty good about. And, you know, they invited me to a sacred fire. I met their elders. It was really beautiful. And I'm growing their plants right now for them. So I'm growing the tobacco, and I'm going to be giving them sweetgrass as well, and a bunch of other food-based plants. So they have an opportunity now to make connections. And I think that with someone like me who worked very hard to get the resources I did, but I do have them now, and I should recognize that as a privilege. It's only right, I think, for me to share them. So I acknowledge that on a very macro level, I'm not an institution with millions of dollars. I don't have really any like ownership, and I say that in quotation marks because, you know, we're on unceded territory. But I have a resource of the greenhouse and my relationship. So I try to make connections through that. So I hope that made sense, but
100%. I think that makes sense. And I love what you're talking about, Cheyenne, in terms of like community care. Like that just feels like, you know, you recognizing that you have maybe some, you know, you're not necessarily, you know, the most well-resourced person ever, but that you've got additional resources in addition to what you maybe need for yourself or the community that you're working with, and using that to kind of reach out and actually build more connections. That's so cool, and such a neat way that your work is actually just like embedded in every level of that kind of community building process. I think that's so cool. Thank you for sharing that. I'm loving this conversation. I feel like my brain is just like working like a mile a minute right now. I'm trying to process all this. I'm so excited that I've been able to have these conversations with our lovely three panelists. And I think that we have time for one more question. Question for one more time. Time for one more question. We've got until about quarter after. And so I just want to kind of pose this question to the entire group, and maybe whoever feels like they want to respond, we'll make sure you have some time to do so. But for me, when I'm thinking about so actually, I'm going to frame this a little bit differently. So I work at the Sexual Assault Center here in town, and our slogan is healing and change. So for me, I feel like those two things are really linked. So healing work and change work are sort of, in the work that I'm doing, feel very inextricably kind of connected to one another. And that you kind of, you know, when we're doing healing work, we're kind of also contributing to change work happening. And when we're doing change work, that also can be part of that healing work, whether that's on an individual basis or a community basis. But I wonder if anyone wanted to speak to what that might look like, that kind of pairing of healing and change work, what that might look like in the context of the work that you're doing. Anyone have any thoughts on that?
So are you asking me? Which one?
Sorry, no, I'm asking whoever. I kind of just opened that one up to the whole group. Krystal, so if you have some thoughts, go for it. Sorry, maybe I wasn't clear about that. But yeah, anyone who would like to share. We have probably about until quarter after, so maybe like 8 minutes left to chat about that. But yeah, whoever might like to share their thoughts on the connection between healing work and change work and how that relates to what they're doing.
So, well, if you can't heal from something if you're in the same environment, right? So I feel like they go hand in hand 100%. So like if you're trying to quit smoking, like if you want healthy lungs, you have to quit smoking in order to, you know, have healthy.
Right, that change is embedded in it.
Yeah, for sure. So like, and like we need to we need to change the environment that the youth are being brought up in. So like when I was a youth, it was a very violent environment growing up, where I was growing up anyways. It was very violent, and it was very cold. Nobody cared about you. You know what I mean? And so, well, like, I don't know, that's just how it felt, right? And so I think to heal from something like that, like we need to and to give them the space to heal, we need to change that. Yeah, we need to completely turn that around. And so I think the biggest thing that comes to mind, with River Rockz, we have a little slogan, I guess you could call it, and it's revolutionize the ripples. And so the idea is that things such as colonialism and the residential school and seizing our land and all of these sorts of things that were done to Indigenous people, it created this ripple effect of intergenerational trauma. And that's kind of a term that comes around quite a bit, is that it's created this ripple effect throughout our communities and throughout the generations of this trauma that we all feel, right? And so what the idea is with River Rockz is that we want to create a ripple effect of positive social change, I guess, is the most vague way to put it, is that we want to instead of putting put those seeds of empowerment and love and care and nurturing and those kinds of things, and help that become a ripple effect so that they feel so good about themselves they want to do that for other youth, and and then help that ripple out throughout the community and the generations. That's kind of the idea that comes to mind for me.
Yeah, I think that's such a perfect example, Krystal, of seeing healing work embedded in change work, and it's one is kind of complementing the other, right? And we're creating through that kind of healing and change work, we're developing community with one another and connecting. Thank you. Anne or Cheyenne? Yeah, Anne, go for it.
I'd answer, one of the most difficult things I find in the work that we do is there's this kind of, they're drug users. That means it's all about needles and then overdose. And then we see industry after industry is set up based on the activism of people who are basically just trying to cope with their environment. So needle exchange was started by drug users, and it was basically, sort of illegal, and all these weird threats this could happen. And in fact, it's still in the criminal code in Canada that to carry drug paraphernalia, unused, well, used or unused, is in the criminal code. No one will ever take, can we just tidy up the criminal code? So I find it gets very kind of, what do you call it? Like a fetishistic, you know what I mean? Ooh, those drug users. And I knew them. And this sort of narrative of heroism, I work at a harm reduction, they've brushed up against this dangerous and weird population. And what really, really helps somebody is, whether they continue to use drugs or stop using drugs, is they need housing and they need a proper welfare check. So it's been very, and I don't find that a very robust movement, the anti-poverty movement. And whether they have to get labeled as a person with a disability, it's even amongst the people who use drugs, we're producing these people. They come from homes where women are expected to raise children on $1,045 a month in Vancouver. You can't even get a room for that. They have these bizarre, completely insane policies, and the broader public seems completely unaware of it. And then they seem so amazed that people's lives aren't working out, because we don't have any of the structural things that we need. We need, the other thing that's happened to our population is they make this sort of fetish, it has to be supportive housing, which means that someone sits at a desk and takes notes on you every day. And there's only 3 places: jail, a mental hospital, and supportive housing in the downtown east side. They have somebody who lets you in and doesn't let you in and makes notes on whether you're okay or not. So you can't even enter your own building. They were so surprised people were kicking the front door in. I was like, why wouldn't you kick the front door in? You come to your own place and you can't get in because you have to be buzzed in, all this super over control. And so if you follow the money on these things, it's easy to understand. But on the other hand, if you really want to know what's healing for people, it's autonomy, it's free choices. And I know I'm old, so I'm sure I'm the oldest person on here. There was a time when people who use drugs didn't get fetishized in this way. And if they went to the welfare office, they got the same welfare check as anybody else. But the housing market wasn't so insane, and they would rent apartments and live in them. And then should you stop using, or you continue to use, at least you had this sort of basic kind of ships in the harbor or floating at a certain level, where now it seems perfectly acceptable to everybody. You have hundreds and hundreds of people homeless living outside without toilets even. So that's what I think is if I was going to say anything that's really healing in our work, what I think that what we've seen go on is, you know, as soon as a drug user knows what a AGM is, they know what emotion is, they know the Societies Act, and if they join another society dealing with poverty or housing, they come in there with a very clear understanding of how these things work. And so we've definitely seen a lot of cross-pollination between our groups and other groups that are based on, you know, social justice, basically, you know. So in terms of that, yes, I would say where people learn, I don't know how to say it. It's like civics. It's like becoming a citizen. And, you know, if you get treated badly at the hospital and kicked out for no reason, you should have the same outrage I do. I'm perfectly, you know, I'm like a great, you know, that's not okay. Where's the complaint process? You know what I mean? Like, and this kind of sense of themselves as worthy and citizens and entitled. Of course they're entitled. It's all of us are. We have civil rights. Anyway.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, yeah, what you're saying about, yeah, helping people to feel like they, yeah, again, are worthy. Like, I think that's a really huge thing, right? Is people feeling like they, you know, have the right to access their rights. Like, you know, human rights existing is one thing, and then being able to actually know that they exist and have access to that and be able to advocate for yourself or others is huge. And it sounds like your work is now working to kind of give folks some of those yeah, just like access and knowing what's out there and what's available to them. Thank you for that. Cheyenne, I wanted to just see if you had anything to add to that before we shift to our Q&A portion of the panel. So the question again was just around how kind of healing and change work maybe are interconnected in the context of what you're doing. I think you're muted still, Cheyenne. Sorry about that.
Sorry about that. Did you say healing and change work?
Yeah, just how you see that kind of connection playing out in the work that you're doing. But no pressure to answer. That was kind of our fourth question. We were only supposed to have 3, so no worries.
I can talk a bit about that. So for healing and change work, probably what I would have to say is that with growing in the margins, it's really important for me not to push people. And as someone who's done Sundance Harvest, and I'm very happy that, you know, I get to pay myself a fair wage, my employees, and I feel secure, I have to understand that not everyone is coming at the same place that I am. So for example, for a lot of the Black youth, and they tell me this through cover letters or in person, they have a hardship coming back to the land, you know, and Mother Earth wasn't the perpetrator, you know, it was the scene of the crime for the transatlantic slave trade here in North America, in the Caribbean islands, you know, in Brazil. And that piece of a lot of Black youth feeling like they don't have access or the ability to farm or not feeling completely comfortable emotionally doing it can take a long time to heal from. It can take a year, it can take 2 years, it can take their whole life. For me, it took me like 2 years. And with that piece, I think the key thing there is ensuring that there's always community. So there's always someone to talk to. There's always someone to be there for support. And you make those supports accessible to them. So you don't just say, oh, you can just call me or text me if you have an issue. You say, here's when I'm available. You make time in person if you can. So I think that's what I try to do, especially with Sundance Harvest. And I can only really speak from that piece because that's my own personal experience. So I can't really speak from healing from other things as well.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Cheyenne. That's yeah, that is a super important consideration in the work that you're doing, and I really appreciate. I love what you're saying too about actually carving out space. It's like the difference between asking someone like, "How can I help?" or "Can I do this to help you?" Right? Like, "Can I do this thing for you?" You know, because sometimes it's hard to make that ask. So actually, just being there and providing that space, I think is amazing. Thank you for that. Thank you all for just this wonderful conversation. I'm so grateful to have been a part of this conversation. And I want to pivot now to the folks who have been listening to this conversation. And I know that there are a few questions in the chat already. So we have about 10, 12 minutes, 15 minutes maybe left together to answer some questions. So the first question that I saw from Jessica was a question for Anne. And I'm just going to read it. It's where can we look for successful examples of organizing that is able to resist co-optation and the tendency for folks who come from community to be replaced by system-affirming figures, particularly thinking about PWUD and HR, but also trying to think about how to advance the movement and help real people in a hostile environment over the long term. Are cooperatives and social justice, and social enterprises a worthwhile way to secure greater independence?
It's the question that we really have to ask ourselves as a social movement, because and I can share this with Jessica. There's a guy named John Zabel, and he kind of laid it out that, you know, when there's this kind of activism where you go and you demand that the government fund this, and in a way that's what we're doing when we say we want, you know, a needle exchange, and then we want overdose prevention sites and injection sites and safe consumption sites, and then our very demand is met, right? And then you become a client. You are this hero doing this, you know, social justice, or what do you call it? Yeah, I mean, you're just going around giving out needles and it's illegal. And then you go around setting up overdose prevention sites and it's illegal. Like, you're taking on the system, and your very action causes what your demand is, which is that public health needs to cover this. This is healthcare. And then they cover it. And much to your horror, you find out that the very people that invented this, that did it all, like, honest to God, this talent's unbelievable. You know what I mean? No money, like every other thing against them. Now they're completely relegated to a client, and somebody else has a job and is no doubt in a union as well. Like, this kind of bureaucracy gets set up. So I think we need to be careful what we lobby for. And we need, like, I love the action, like, you know, you can demand that the government dig a well. And if they won't do it, you go dig your own well. But then you've got to keep stewardship of that well. Now, what I'm finding is it's mostly a capacity thing. I try to imagine, I'm so jealous of all these other projects, because I keep thinking, wouldn't it be a thing where you didn't have, you know, like 20% of your members dying every year? And, you know, I went to a meeting once and they said, how come there's no drug users? And I got this huge challenge from these people, and they were really mean. And I finally, you know, I kept thinking, well, why aren't there? And the death rates, that's what it was. All of the, like, it's like having a job where you're teaching school to dying children or something. Like, it's an odd kind of calling to have yourself developing leadership amongst a population that just has such incredible death rates. And so we did at one point set up a social enterprise at the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users. The problem was that we needed, the talent who will come in, and often they'll be non-drug users, but they need to be very clear about that they work for the board. They can be hired and fired by the board. The board also needs to be clear. As I say to them, don't ever hire anyone unless you know how to fire them. And it's not I'm not putting a stain on that person. It's just in terms of process. It's kind of like being able to get married, but never figuring out how to get divorced. It's not a good thing. You need to know. And it's just a practical thing. But, and I find that people who have been terribly oppressed and treated unfairly are very hesitant to fire someone, for instance. And because they keep saying, well, you know, we've got to understand this. I'm going, look, our whole outfit's going to sink. We've got hundreds and thousands of people that we need to get this work done for. It's really okay to fire people, you know, do it kindly, you know, give them lots of, you know, whatever leave, but we live in the real world, and we can't just sort of turn our groups into these weak, pathetic huddles of ineptitude, because, you know, after all, they're all drug users, you know, they can't do things. And I keep saying, no, drug users are grown-ups and they're adults. And once you enter the world of funding, you need to be very clear that this is, again, the art and science. There's all the tricks you can do to be a non-hierarchical organization who still follows the Societies Act, which is a very hierarchical piece of legislation, but you have to be registered under it. So you learn that's what I've become very good at. The social enterprise that Vandu did, we made it very, very rigid, because there was a kind of, I don't know if other groups have to deal with this. So a board member comes up to somebody who's on a volunteer shift at an OPS and says, there's a rule, oh, you can't come into this part. You know what I mean? It's just anyone who enters the place, look, this is just for us. This is staff, or you can't go in and get your own supplies, whatever. You know, you have these kind of, you know, it's just normal stuff. And they go, I'm on the board, and if you don't let me do that, I'm going to get you fired. So this staff board relationships, I know all nonprofits deal with it. So when we set up the social enterprise for Vandu, we did it as an actual business. And there was no way to approach the board and get all this muddly crap. You were either hired or fired. You either did your job or you didn't. And we were putting ourselves out to the business world. Our jobs that we were able to find a niche in, and it was very urgent at first, was cleaning up rooms that had tons of needles and things in them, and the normal services that did that wouldn't go in. So we said, we're not afraid of those people. We are those people. We're good. We'll go in. And then we saw the other for-profit non-drug user groups. They've basically taken it back. But it really means having the capacity of having a grant writer and enough structure of people who don't want to be board members, don't want any power, and want this project to succeed. And they're very rare. And I don't know why, because I think as things go for drug users with these massive numbers of overdoses, they go for all of us. And as we treat any marginalized group badly by, you know, taking out all the garbage cans on Hastings because they might deal drugs out of them, taking all the shelter of the bus stops away because they huddle there out of the rain. We all have to stand in the rain then. So don't do mean things to people, because you're doing mean things to all of us. And that's been a difficult thing to spread the word on, and have this sense of getting rid of this kind of real fetish. I call it that, but I mean like just this hatred. They view them as not from our communities. Ironically, they are more likely to be from your community than someone who's like Vancouver's a town where everyone's moved here, just saying.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, in the user groups, often people are all from Vancouver and maybe were born here in quite marginalized settings. So anyway, I find it's difficult to step away from the urgency of saving lives with, you know what I mean? There's a house on fire, so you're throwing water at it. Right. To be able to sit back and make a really long-term plan about what are the determinants of health and why it's so important that we unite with these other groups, or that we lead these fights for, you know, social justice, for housing and welfare, and because we're just producing more and more traumatized people, partly because their parents are dead from overdose, which no one's allowed to talk about in some families. And you know what I mean? There's just this spilling over harm, and the number of drug users never goes down. You know, I've been at this for 30 years. You think, you know, we had 5,000 drug users in the downtown east side. We still have 5,000 drug users. And I think, hey, they're coming. These are people, you know, that are coping. It's a coping strategy for extreme trauma. And we are just like a trauma making society.
Yeah.
What is trauma? That seems to be what we're really, really good at.
Yeah, it feels like we're not addressing those root causes, right? And we're just kind of powering full steam ahead and putting band-aids on things, right? And it's almost like people don't actually have a thorough understanding of what the root causes are. But it feels so like just as you're describing, and like it's so obvious that if people have, you know, stable housing, and if people have, you know, access to, you know, support in working through trauma, like you know, we can disrupt this cycle, and it's not impossible, but it takes a different approach. And yes, I'm grateful to hear about the work that you're doing to challenge the status quo and the systems as they are. I do notice that there's another question from the community, and this is for the broader group. So the question is, there are many important social causes and justice-oriented ways to respond. How can people who are involved in different causes share best practices or discover intersections between different causes? So if anyone would like to speak to that, you can just unmute yourself and go for it. And that question's also, oh, sorry, it's directly sent to me. So I can read the question again. So there are many important social causes and justice-oriented ways to respond. How can people who are involved in different causes share best practices or discover intersections between different causes? I think that this connects a little bit to our conversation from earlier when we were kind of talking about the ways in which our work sort of intersects with or creates community for other folks. And I wonder if anyone has anything that they want to add to, yeah, how do people kind of share in their best practices, and yeah, how do we identify those intersections between what we're working on and what other folks might be working
on? So there's lots of intersections. Yeah, so like I feel intersected with both of the panelists here and their organizations here. I guess like, well, so I guess I'm trying to stop the youth from going to Anne. You know what I'm saying? So like, but I still value what Anne's doing. And I have my own personal reasons why I think that work is important. But I'm also trying to be here for the youth who are going through, you know, trauma of having relatives that are going to Anne, right? So like, you know, so just trying to be there. So I guess like we're all working for the community, so we're working kind of on the same goal, just in different, we all have our own like different roles, right? And like food and growing food, that is like so important and underrated, honestly. Like it's so important but sadly underrated, you know. But in connecting the youth with the land, it's like everything, and it's like nowhere, you know. Like it's just really important, and I feel like that can intersect all across the board, because like anything we do, it's on the land, right? And we all got to eat, and we want to be eating healthy, and like their diet has to do with everything. It has to do with how you feel about yourself, it has to do with your mood, so that has to deal with your interactions with other people, you know. It has to do with like so much. And then just like, yeah, connecting with the land. And then there's tons of cultural teachings in there that, you know, there's lots of room for connections. And so I guess panels are a good way of coming together to share those diverse perspectives and connecting with one another in that regards. But I'd like to see, yeah, more opportunities for connection, right? So like, for instance, like maybe like I'm working with a youth group, and you know, they're artsy, and then but we would do like a collaboration with the greenhouse. I'd be interested to see what that looks like, you know. Are we gonna make beadwork or paint a mural on the side of the greenhouse or something? I don't know. Or like, but then exchange those teachings and that knowledge, and then so that's stuff that you still carry with you in a day-to-day, right? Like we're not just focusing on one element and one avenue and one practice, but like we're humans that dabble in like a lot of different areas. And so like food is definitely for everybody, you know. And so yeah, and even if you're not like super artistic, like everybody still enjoys doing art once in a while, right? And we can still make those human connections, right? And so like there's the doing, but there's also the being. And so like we're human beings, we're not human doings. And a lot of the time when we're talking about ourselves, we're like, this is what I do. Like they introduce yourself, okay, well, this is what I do is usually the first thing that comes out of people's mouths. But at the end, but really like, but who are you? You know, like I'm a human being, right? We're all human beings. And so let's just be together and like, you know, learn from one another and exchange one another and connect, right? Just connect. And then the doing is just the extra thing that brings us together to like, you know, connect with one another. But really what you're doing is you're connecting stories, you know, you're connecting like body language, perspectives, you know, like just different areas that you can relate with one another, you know, just, yeah. So that, I guess, I don't know if that speaks directly to what you were asking, but that's just thoughts that came to my mind.
Thanks so much for that, Krystal. Yeah, I think that definitely speaks to the question that was posed. I'm just looking at the comments here, and I just do want to acknowledge that we, I think we're just about 2 minutes over when we were supposed to be wrapping up. I'm not seeing any additional questions. Cheyenne, I did want to give you the opportunity, though, if you had anything to add or comment on that last question, but no pressure if you'd like to leave it there.
I don't really have anything to add. I feel like both Anne and Krystal brought amazing perspectives.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. And there's a lot of love in the chat right now, and people sharing their gratitude for everything that all of you shared this afternoon. So yeah, thank you all for spending this time with me. And I'm grateful to have been able to facilitate some of this conversation. And it feels a little bit selfish on my part. I feel like I'm just gathering all of this, this information from all of these fabulous community builders. And yeah, it's so grateful to have been a part of this. So I am going to pass things back to Taylor, I believe, and just to kind of wrap us up.
Thank you, Jess. Anne, I noticed you unmuted. Was there anything you wanted to add just before we?
No, just that I try to find humor in it. It's absolutely grim. We were like, we've got Work Safe BC. What about workplace violence? Like there's these little conspiracies amongst, the RCMP, and then you'll find out they've contacted the bylaw enforcement, and then they've contacted Work Safe BC, and there's this, and I thought, look at all the networking we're causing, and I'm sure they're building community. I was just hoping that it's going to be as easy the other way when we knock the. I just see the humor in that when you talk about networking. Just saying that you can get all kinds of people united in hatred, and I think we never really use that as a dynamic. But what can happen is, or my observation over many, many years, it would at one point, drug, people think, oh, Vancouver's always been nice to drug addicts. No, they weren't. We organized a drug user group, and there's this kind of charming disarmament that went on with this kind of, we didn't play big shot. We didn't do too much. We had very, very humble funding. We just attended all these community meetings, and people would go, oh, I wouldn't have known you were a drug user unless you had told me. And like, no kidding. You have to test their pee to figure out whether they're using drugs. Anyway, some of the, I don't know if other people have a comment on that, but and maybe I'm just so desperate for humor. I find that funny. And when you talk about networking and, all these people all creating these contacts with one another because they hate us so much, just saying. I thought it was, I guess that isn't funny. It seems funny to me.
A very dark sense of humor, but I totally understand where you're coming from. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I do think humor is an excellent tool and vehicle for when we are kind of playing with these really heavy things and experiences of oppression, and while we're motivated towards social justice. Yeah, humor is a fantastic tool. And it's been a theme throughout this week as well. We've been chatting a lot about like play and carving out space for joy and how we connect with one another, even when we're navigating really tricky things. So yeah, thank you for reminding us of a return to humor. I just want to thank everyone for being here, and to all of our panelists. I know Cheyenne had to go, but it was wonderful to learn from her and from Anne and Krystal. And thank you so much for moderating, Jess. This was fantastic. We have been doing a thing where we stick around and do some breakout rooms. I am mindful of time. Feel free to leave if you've got to go, zero pressure. But if you have the capacity to stick around, we can